Hello, my name is John Fowler. I'm a safety manager for a large drilling company. I've been in the drilling industry for about 20 years, and I've been in safety for over 10 years. Today, I'm doing a National Groundwater Association Industry Connect video on hazard recognition. Now, hazard recognition is one of the most important things that we can do out in the field. It's something that really should be done before work starts, but also throughout the entire workday, because as we all know, hazards change. One of the best ways to identify hazards is actually to have a fresh pair of eyes come out. That's why it's really important when you have new guys that come out to the project to kind of ask them to go around and look for hazards, because they might find something that you've overlooked for years and years that just jumps out to them. So new eyes are always a great way of identifying hazards out there. Now, the main way that we're going to identify hazards is through experience. Our experience on the job, our experience with the equipment, knowing what we've had happen in the past, knowing what might happen or what we've heard about. So we always want to use our experience, think about what could happen, think about what has happened. But even with experience, we're scientifically measured to only catch about 45% of the hazards on a site, on a work site. And this is something that many different people have been studying, trying to figure out the best way to increase people's hazard recognition abilities. And they've had studies where a crew goes out, inspects a job site, and then where a professional safety person goes out, inspects a job site. And what's amazing is that both the crews and the professional safety people only catch about 45% of the hazards. So the key is trying to pick up that other 55% that just go unnoticed. Now, when it comes to hazard recognition training and tools, there are a couple resources out there which are very helpful. OSHA has a training tool. You can go to the OSHA website and you can actually download almost like a simulation. And in this simulation, you can download it. They don't have one for well drilling or pump pulling or anything, but they have them for construction, for manufacturing. And you can kind of download this and then show pictures of a work site and go around and identify hazards, and it'll let you know if you've identified all of them. So that's a pretty good tool. One of the best tools out there, though, is the energy wheel. So this is something that Jim Wright wrote about in the Groundwater magazine in October of 2022. But it is a very good and simple tool for identifying hazards out in the field. Now, there's a website, and the link information is going to come along with this video. It's Safety Function is the name of the company. They're really one of the biggest companies that are pushing this energy wheel and have really good training when it comes to this energy wheel. I'm going to discuss it generally. In no means am I giving you the full energy wheel training. I'm just doing an outline of how it works so that you can see how it functions and make that decision for yourself. You can go and pay about $49 for a 30-minute introductory video to the energy wheel, or you can pay $99 for a 3-hour, much more in-depth video for the energy wheel. So that's completely up to you which one you pick, but it's a great tool for actually identifying the hazards. And the reason why it works so well is because our brains are programmed to just pick up, like I said, about 45% of the hazards. Really the low-hanging fruit. Like there are certain hazards that our brains just key in on, and there's certain hazards that even though they might be staring us in the face, that our brains don't recognize. So what this energy wheel does is give your brain some prompting so that you remember about all the different categories when it comes to hazard recognition. So if you look at the energy wheel, the easiest hazard for us to identify is gravity. We walk onto a site and we see that there's a suspended load, or we see that there's something which is up on blocks or something like that. Our brains very quickly recognize that as a hazard. It's just something that's naturally wired into us. So gravity is usually one of the first hazards that we're going to see out there just because of the way we're wired. And once again, this is me just working along the energy wheel and showing you how you can use this to really help recognize hazards out in the field. So after gravity, we have motion. Motion, once again, this is something that we are hardwired to identify, whether that's moving equipment, whether that's something swinging or something that potentially could move, our minds are just going to key in on that and they're going to say, watch out, that right there is a hazard. Next up on the energy wheel is mechanical. So that would have to do with guarding, things like that. Now, as we start working our way around this wheel, it's going to take more and more of us really kind of making a conscious effort to look at this stuff to actually capture these hazards. A lot of times when you walk up, you might see something mechanical, but you really have to kind of stop and think and say to yourself, you know, I need to make sure there's some sort of guarding around that so that I don't get caught up in it. After mechanical, there's electrical. And of course, in our industry, we have a lot of electrical things to deal with. Everything from overhead power lines to electrical boxes, maybe on the pumps that we're installing. But a lot of times you don't see the electrical hazards. Maybe it's an energized piece of equipment, or in our industry, perhaps it's buried electrical lines. As always, we need to always make sure we understand what's under the ground so we don't actually dig into something. And that's where this energy wheel really helps, because you can stand there and just look out at your site, whether that's a drilling site, whether you're running a pump, and you can see all the things that you can see. But by grabbing this energy wheel and actually forcing your brain to work through each one of these hazards, it'll make you think. And this is a perfect example of that. Because if you're using the wheel right, when you get to electrical, you'll be looking at the site and you'll say, okay, well, I don't see any power lines. We're not doing electrical work. I don't think there's anything energized. And hopefully this would get you to ask the question, hey, have we done our blue stake? Have we called Miss Utility? Have we made sure that there's nothing in the ground here that we might drill into? So that's the whole point of this, is just to get you to think. So that's electrical. And then now, once again, we're getting to things that you don't necessarily catch right off the bat. The next kind of energy is pressure. And that could be anything from air pressure that we have on sites to hydraulic pressure to fluid pressure. Once again, making you think, yeah, you know what? We've got a bunch of energized airlines over there. We really should inspect those airlines. We need to make sure they have whip checks, et cetera, et cetera. And then next up is sound. Well, we obviously deal with a lot of sound. Our equipment is pretty loud. But we need to think about things like when we're leaving pressure. If we're drilling with air and now it's time to relieve some of that air pressure, we need to think about how that's going to impact us. We need to make sure that we have our hearing protection on, our earplugs in, so that when there is a sudden loud sound, it doesn't damage our hearing. And then next up is radiation. Not something that we typically deal with. You don't really think about radiation when you're out on either a drill site or a pump site. But one of the things, radiation that typically we run into is when we're welding. A lot of people forget that you can actually get yourself a pretty good sunburn when you're welding. So it's important when you're welding to make sure you have the right PPE. I know that on some of the projects that I've worked on, we have had very large diameter casing that we're welding, and we've had two different welders, both basically welding in opposite directions, kind of welding to each other. That way we can weld the casing twice as fast. And what we found out kind of the hard way is that the arc flash from one welder can very easily bounce off the rig mast and actually come in the face shield, behind the face shield, and actually cause issues for the other welder. So just a little something to think about is you want to protect the welders. And then this is a MSHA requirement. So this is a mine requirement, but I think it's very valid and it's worth thinking about. Whenever you're welding, it's really good practice to have some sort of tarp up so that you're not subjecting everyone else on the pad to that flash from arc. So even though when I first say radiation, you might say to yourself, well, there's no radiation, right? There's no radioactivity out on the drill site. But I think we forget a lot that there is actual radiation we deal with, whether it's the sun, whether it's welding. So hopefully, once again, this tool here, this energy wheel, will actually make you think about such things. And then next up on the energy wheel is biological. So biological, that is usually insects, snakes, that kind of thing, which now is the winter time. So it's a pretty good time to be working out on these pads and out in the desert or wherever else we're working. But as we all know, as it gets hotter and hotter, all these creepy crawlies are going to come out. And this hopefully would spark some good conversation, just reminding people not to put their hands under pallets, basically don't put your hands where you can't see, that kind of thing. And then after the biological hazard, or the energy, I should say, is chemical. Now, one of the biggest things with chemical is making sure that you have SDSs, which are safety data sheets, available on your site. Now, SDSs can be printed off. I think, though, that that is extremely cumbersome to have a gigantic binder full of printed off SDSs. So there are a lot of apps now which will work both with and without service. And you can actually work with that company and make sure that all of your chemicals are loaded onto that app. So there's different ways to make sure that your SDS is available, but we may get really complacent working around the chemicals that we use. And it's important to remember that some of them are pretty nasty. I mean, and what I mean by that is even diesel fuel. Diesel fuel is a carcinogen. So we get so used to working with diesel fuel all the time that we forget that diesel fuel itself has hazards. So I think that goes to a lot of the different chemicals we use. And it's really important to make sure that we have SDSs out there on site. So hopefully the way that this would work would be when you got the energy wheel around a chemical, there'd be a little brief discussion. You look around the site and you might say, you know what? That's a new chemical we're using. Our client wanted us to try out this chemical to do whatever, some specialized thing. We need to check and make sure we have an SDS for that. That's what this whole energy wheel is supposed to do. Just like electrical, just like radiation, is really make you step back and think for a second about what the different energies are out there. After chemical comes temperature. So, it might be just environmental temperature, working outside in the heat. Sometimes you're working around, no, I shouldn't say sometimes, most times you're working around equipment, which is very hot. I know one of the things that our sort of newer people forget sometimes is that, especially in the summertime, when you have these big diesel motors running, that the exhaust itself can cause damage. And people forget that the exhaust can actually burn people. And speaking of burns, that actually brings me back to chemical. I hate to jump back, but I realize this is something that I think people really overlook, is that when we're doing work on these wells, a lot of times we use cement. Sometimes we use a little bit of cement. Sometimes we use a lot of cement. There's some people who can very easily get burned by cement, and there's some people who can't. But I think it's one of the most overlooked hazards when it comes to a drill site are the cement burns. And people will get cement burns and say, oh, that's just this happens sometimes. But we have to remember that those cement burns are actual burns. So they do make cement burn kits out there. They're actually very handy. They have a neutralizer in it so that if you do get cement on you, you wash off the cement, you spray this neutralizer on, and it'll prevent you from getting a burn. So once again, that would be when you work through the energy wheel and you say, chemical, what are we doing today? Oh, well, we're doing a cement job. Hey, let's make sure we have some neutralizer on site in case somebody gets a cement burn. So once again, this is just supposed to sort of key you in. So those are the different energies that the energy wheel talks about. I went through it the way that you're supposed to. Once again, I'm not teaching you some kind of class. You're not a certified energy wheel person at all by now. I'm just giving you a very brief overview of it. But this is the point, is that you're going to work your way through the energy wheel. And hopefully as you do that, the different energies that are on the wheel will clue you in to something that you may have overlooked without it. It's just going to make you think. And it definitely is getting more and more popular in the industry. Like I said, there's a good article on it that Jim Wright wrote in October of 2022 that talks about it. And it just really is a great tool. And although the classes themselves do cost money, actually downloading the energy wheel itself, there's different papers about it, all of that is free. So there's a lot of free material that comes along with this as well, which is what I think also makes it such a useful tool, is there's not a huge cost associated with it. Now, of course, once you found these hazards, now what are you going to do about it? Well, obviously, if you're doing some sort of task out in the field, you're going to get a control for that. So you're going to figure out, for example, if you're going to be exposed to cement, you're going to figure out, okay, well, let's make sure we have a cement burn kit. If you're doing welding, let's make sure we put a tarp up, et cetera, et cetera. So this will key you in, and then you'll actually control those hazards out in the field. Now, when we're doing our hazard recognition, when we're doing our pre-job, walking around the site, that kind of thing, one of the best things that we can do with the hazards is to not only correct them, but to turn them in. A lot of companies have requirements for near misses to be turned in, for hazards to be turned in, but it's very important for that drilling company to understand what the hazards are out there so that the company can work to correct those hazards. I mean, both MSHA and OSHA require an employer to keep you safe from known hazards. And the key to that is the known hazards part. And the only way for that company to know is for you to turn it in. So please, when you're doing your walkarounds out there and you see something that's wrong, whether it's a procedure that's wrong, whether it's a piece of equipment that's bad, please correct it, but then turn in something so that your employer knows what the hazards are so that going down the road, they can correct that proactively so you don't have to worry about catching it when you're out in the field. Well, that's just a brief talk about hazard recognition. The links to the energy wheel and to the OSHA tool are going to be part of this. And thank you for your time.